In the Polaroid book, Legacy of Light, Robert Stone has got an essay called Portraits that opens like this. In the teeming world, each of us is condemned to a fundamental solitude. We live our lives in the isolation of the self. A primal mystery separates one human being from another, and in the end, we can only imagine our way across this gulf. The earliest and most important lessons we learn concern how to make ourselves at home in a world whose most significant quality is the presence of other people. What is human in the world is what is most familiar, yet human nature and human motivation remain the things that we argue and ponder most, and by which we are most often bewildered. Our moral systems tell us to identify ourselves with our neighbors, but we quickly recognize others as an ambitious presence, sometimes even as a threat to life and to safety, rather than a source of fellowship and support. Human nature, it is finally agreed, is enigmatic. Know thyself, we say, the implication being that this helps. When I was 7, my family and I spent a summer in England for my dad's job, so while he was at work, my brother and mom and I would play and do a little bit of sightseeing because my mom was interested in making the most of our time there. Once we got back to the States, I didn't leave for another 14 years and grew up among my own people and my own culture, very much at home, as much as anyone can be. My memories of England are all but gone now, hazy glances of nostalgia at best that lack much of any foreign quality, despite being formed across the pond, because at that age, life itself is pretty foreign, and the scope of my focus at the time hardly extended to the whole country. And then, all of a sudden, I grew up and found myself on a plane bound for Amsterdam, leaving the country for what felt like the first time. My friends from school were with me. Well, I didn't know they would be friends when we left, but for our 2 weeks abroad, they were my America, sharing cultural cues and references, and even the same language, which was a benefit I hadn't expected to need. Before leaving, I'd had the idea that since we looked the same, the people of Western Europe would be just like Americans, only living somewhere else, and it didn't take long to realize that these are, in fact, a distinct people whose looks may be shared with Americans, but whose essence is not. Our respective histories have spawned 2 separate entities, and to each the other is foreign, which left me startled at how different everything was. I'd never been a foreigner before, except for my nearly forgotten time in England. There's this surprising thing about being in a group where you're the only one of a kind, because while I would have expected the pressure of that kind of difference to press on your personal identity or even alter it, what I've found over and over is that the clarity of such a sharp contrast is actually such an encouragement to be who you are. Your identity tends to stand out so strongly against everyone else's, which reveals a pretty clear picture of who you are, who they are, and who you could be if you really leaned into it. So it was that our surrounding company of Amsterdammers and study abroad students built up in me a humble patriotism and better understanding of myself as a person of faith. I was fortunate enough to know a few people in our group before we left from classes I'd already had with them, so by the time we arrived, I knew who my roommate would be and who I could talk to for something more than an introductory conversation. My friend Will and I had just a few days before finished carrying an absolutely massive semester-long group project, so we figured that, having survived Hellfire together, we'd at least make good roomies. Our cohort organized itself pretty quickly into groups of business and art students that, for the most part, stuck to themselves when given the option, and were interested in pretty different kinds of fun, although there was plenty to be found in Amsterdam. It's such an easy city to lose yourself in, especially if you've got any interest in oblivion seeking. Amsterdam, much more so than Prague, has got a lot to offer tourists that's illegal in the States, and I think that accounts for a lot of their revenue from tourists, because it motivates so many people to visit. John Green has this wonderful quote where he says, "The worst part about travel is that you've got to bring yourself along." because as boundary breaking and culturally challenging as travel can be, it's still all filtered through your own mind, and whatever baggage you've got, you bring it along too. But Amsterdam offers plenty of escape from yourself and passage into other, more abstract types of consciousness that seem to encourage the types of openness that make travel so rewarding. These are wonderful mindsets, but I don't honestly think most tourists are that thoughtful about it. While in Amsterdam, we had a neighbor on the 8th floor who was an old Venetian woman named Juliana, and one morning I sat by her at breakfast. Maybe it had something to do with my striped shirt and short shorts, but shortly after striking up the conversation, she told me that I reminded her of a little French boy, so she would call me Nino. We talked about our trips and where we were from in a mix of Italian and English, and while I don't speak Italian, I was able to recognize enough words from taking Spanish class in high school to understand. She was traveling with her daughter for vacation, and they had gone to a museum where a group of music students had given them a free concert. It might be that the primary experience of being a foreigner is isolation, but every now and then I'm surprised by instances of human warmth and connection. Juliana laughed easily and seemed unfazed by the language barrier, although I was very concerned about being misunderstood because without a shared language, I didn't know where the boundaries were or what I could say that she would understand. The Europeans I've had contact with seem more comfortable with situations like these than Americans, and I wonder if that's because there's more precedent for international travel in Europe, since the neighboring countries are closer together and more permeable. But in any event, that's the story of how I earned the nickname Nino for the rest of the trip. The relational landscape of Prague made it feel much more foreign than Amsterdam, especially having grown up in the American South and having been raised with Southern hospitality as the proverbial water in which we swam. On our first day there, our tour guide Hunke told us how under the authoritarianism of the 20th century, it was simply not safe to be happy while out and about because it was too conspicuous and you'd be thought to be up to something. Not to mention how there just wasn't a lot to smile about, given the grimly impoverished conditions of everyday life. Like a generational curse, this scarcity mindset for emotional resources has yet to die out. In its current stage, it has moved past outright fear and into, along with the general improvement in quality of life, a kind of detached cynicism and absolutely cutting sense of dark humor. Divorce rates are high, and marriage is infrequent. Dates are casual, and it takes a long time to be let in. Friendships are slow burns with lots of breaks and fighting. As a whole, the nature of knowing and being known in Prague is a bleak one set up by fear, unmet needs, and an atmosphere of distrust. Which is why it ought to come as no surprise that Kafka is one of the city's most celebrated artists, an author whose work is dominated by injustice, random misfortune, and most notably, the bizarre. It's easy to take the temperature of a place by looking at the art it creates, and while it's become harder to do this in such a post- or meta-modern age as our own, Kafka was writing in one where his books were indicative of his culture. They resonated then, and they resonate now for a reason, probably because they speak to the experience of their readers, even in their abstract and, at times, upsetting way. During our week in Prague, the city was alight with the celebration of the 100th anniversary of his death, and the message was clear. We feel seen by Kafka's stories, and if you want to know us, read them. Prague is a beautiful city with a rich culture that will be accepted on no terms other than its own. It's a direct route to one of the foremost lessons of travel and being a foreigner, that our goal should be to make the most of what is already shared and not force resolution on the areas of cultural tension, because it's in the difference that we see the fullest image of the truth. A foreigner is someone surrounded by others who are all unified in not being like them. This is the same thing as Robert Stone's fundamental solitude that he describes every person as being condemned to, but the thing is, he wasn't talking about foreigners. He was just laying out a framework for the problem that people in general face of living in a world with other people, and this great overlap leads us right to the heart of it all. We are all foreign to each other. Each individual may as well be another country, and like other countries, we deserve not to be colonized by rules and ideas, but thoughtfully explored with curiosity and passion. Discussions of isolationism versus altruism are never had in the abstract, because the likelihood that the nearest foreign country is sitting in the same room as you grants us all the responsibility of having our own personal foreign policies. The experience of traveling abroad is a challenging one, especially the first time, but what was most startling about our time in Prague and Amsterdam was how oddly familiar it was to be a foreigner, what it felt like to be at square one with everybody. Getting out there forces us to reckon with that primal mystery that separates one human from another, shoves it in your face, and removes all the familiar comforts and people we could turn to escape it. To travel is to face the ordinary problem of being known, blown up to the size of a country, too impossibly large to address on our own, but finally big enough to see how it works. It is no simple or easy thing to fill in the shoes of a foreigner, and not everybody who does chooses it. But those who walk its road with openness are privileged to a special vision of reality, one of boundary breaking and nuance. It's a move toward wholeness, away from the systems and ideas that divide us, and towards an integrated understanding of what connects us and, most importantly, makes us people.